Hey y'all, I'm Kim, host of Book Marketing Mania, and I'm so thrilled you're tuning in to learn how to build your audience and reach new readers as a podcast host and guest. If you have an idea for sharing your hard story in your book in a way that serves and impacts others, you are going to love today's conversation with my new friend, Mandy Capehart. Mandy is a certified grief educator and trauma professional, and she's also author of Restorative Grief, Embracing Our Losses Without Losing Ourselves. And she hosts a podcast by the same name. Mandy and I connected on the PodMatch platform, and I couldn't wait to have her as a guest to share how her book has become a form of grief insurance, how she recommends you start documenting your hard story, how she shares her book with her listeners who she says are in a care desert, which is something, y'all, I cannot stop thinking about. And of course, she's using the PodMatch service to meet and serve new podcast hosts and has lots to share about that as well. You are in for a treat today with Mandy, so let's get to it. Welcome, Mandy. I'm so thrilled to have you on Book Marketing Mania today.
Hey, Kim. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. This is so fun. And y'all heard me gush about Mandy in my introduction, but I would just love for you to tell us, Mandy, about your book, Restorative Grief, and who you wrote it for.
Yeah. So my book, Restorative Grief, Embracing Our Losses Without Losing Ourselves, first was written for me. I was going through the loss of my mom in 2016 and a handful of other losses. I honestly don't know that there's a year that I haven't lost somebody that I cared about in some way or another. So when I lost her in 2016, things kind of spiraled for a couple of years. And I would say in about 2018, I realized, gosh, the people around me just do not know what to do with me. I don't know what to do with that because I was a worship leader. I was heavily involved in my church, and bless their hearts, no one knew what to say, what to do, how to show up for me in any way. So I started writing down the things that mattered to me, the things that moved the needle toward healing for me, that felt like healing. And in 2020, I was going through another miscarriage. I had lost my job. And of course, we all know what was happening in March. And I lost my job again, another one, and decided it's time for me to write this down. If ever there was a time for me to write a book about loss, now is it, because the globally untended grief I'm about to face is something that's going to be generational. And I don't want to live in that world without contributing some kind of support or something from my own story. So I wrote a 31-day guidebook that is basically geared toward the church or anyone that's involved in some way in a faith community to learn how to, as a grief supporter, be a stronger, more curious, more teachable grief supporter. And also, if you're grieving and in that community, to learn how to open yourself and become more curious about what is possible so that hope can remain without turning into spiritual bypassing and minimizing of our pain. So my book is vast in who it serves. And I frequently say, chew the meat and spit out the bones. So if you're someone who is struggling, if faith is part of your grief story, I often say, read it anyway and throw away what doesn't serve. There will be one thing. And if there's one thing, then it was worth it.
Yeah. Wow. And I was just thinking like that's such a book that you would have. And I mean, I think of like any kind of devotional, like you pull out at different times, like you're grieving this specific, grief, this specific loss, but then like you might have a friend grieving something different, or a family member that you can share with. And then God's going to lead you back to it when you grieve again, because like you're saying, you went through so many losses and I've experienced that same thing and different losses, but you're always turning to that same thing. Like, I mean, obviously we turn to God's word, but I love that there can be a book that you can share with yourself many times over, as well as share with other friends. And yeah, that's beautiful. And I mean, all that you have kind of like just taken that up and decided, what I first heard you say was, this book was for other people, really. I mean, and it usually is, but yet it's so much, we get so involved in it. I mean, I still have yet to write my first book. And I just keep thinking it's just so hard, especially when you do want to write about something hard. It's so hard to get it on paper and just to be thinking the whole time somebody else is going to read it, even though you do want to help somebody with it. So I would love to ask you, for our listeners that feel kind of that same way I do, that just are a little bit more cautious about it, what kind of tips would you share to where you can kind of start documenting things along the way, I guess?
Part of what I do as a grief professional and educator is work with people on the value of marking the moment. So that can sound like journaling. And for some people, journaling is really accessible. For others, it's extremely challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to any type of process or story that you want to sit down and capture, even in anecdotes, it's about marking the moment with the pause, with waiting, with giving yourself rest between
Mm-hmm.
each activity we're rushing toward, and noticing what was it about that moment, that experience that was meaningful for me. What of my core values connects back to that event that makes me want to write it down, that makes me think this could be something I could put in my book someday, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
fiction or a nonfiction story. We're inspired all day, every day, if we will pay attention, if we will slow down, if we will notice and make a note about what is moving us. And so for me and in my writing process, certainly I'm doing it constantly. What around me resonates and why? What around me is actually moving the needle forward in my growth, in my understanding, in my heart, mind, body, spirit, integrative spirituality, all of that work that we do to create more space within ourselves. I'm making notes about it because ultimately the book I wrote is not the book I thought I would write someday. I always
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be an author, but I had no idea I would have to experience all of the things I did. And then this was the book. And it's not the first book I've tried to write, right? So being able to recognize, well, there was value alignment in this work and in the stories I told throughout it that brought it to fruition. It wasn't a battle uphill. It was, honest to God, really easy to write. They don't tell you about the self-publishing world is really, really hard. And traditional publishing is really, really hard. But the process of writing came out of me naturally because it was coming from an overflow of what I was already doing for myself. And so marking the moments, making space for myself, becoming more curious, working to open my nervous system and even just my awareness to learn and my willingness to learn, it changed my writing process and made this kind of work very accessible. The piece of writing it for other people is where I became very gentle in my words.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to be a pretty outwardly spoken, assertive, aggressive, some might say personality. And so
Mm-hmm.
in this work, knowing it takes such a gentle hand, being able to kind of take a step back and let my lens not be the only lens of the writing itself, thinking about who would be reading this someday, thinking about my audience and who I want to encourage and who I want to support made a big difference too. It helped me take things out that didn't need to be there. It certainly helped me say, there's a gap here. I need more education. I need more experience, whatever that is, to really create something meaningful. And so, yeah, it was a book that, of course, was for me, but ultimately, I knew this was something I wanted to create to serve others. And it turns out that way because I think I intentionally realized this isn't just me being creative and writing a book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is a tool of healing for people.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as you were talking through that, like how important it is to walk through some of these things with a professional like yourself. And some of those things, like when you were saying them, I was like, okay, I could do some of these things, but not think of writing a book, like just, just that journaling or just, yeah, starting to really, like you said, is it mark the moment? I cannot.
Yep. Marking the moment.
This is staying in my mind. So I love that so much. Yeah, so that's so great. And I'll definitely carry that forward, as I'm sure many of our listeners will. And I was thinking about you talking about your strong personality, because I know you're an Enneagram 8, right,
I
Mandy?
am.
And a lot of our listeners, we talk a lot about our Instagram numbers, especially on social media, back and forth. And we did an episode a while back on the different Enneagram numbers and how they relate to book marketing. And one thing I wanted to ask Mandy about, because she is into the Enneagram as well. And I'm a 9. So if that tells you anything, Mandy, the peacemaker, I'm married to an 8. So I'm like, oh my gosh, an 8. I'm so not worthy. I admire y'all's personalities. But I was thinking through, I had asked Mandy, and she did give me a link that I'll put in the show notes because I did want to ask Mandy about this. And we decided it would needed to be a whole different conversation, but I wanted to be able to give y'all a resource about how each Enneagram number can face grief, because I think we all face it very differently. And I think it's important to know, just if you are familiar with your Enneagram number, just I know I would go about it much different than my husband, just like you probably too, Mandy. And so I'll definitely put a link in those show notes. And that's just, like I said, a whole nother conversation. I might just have to have you back on, Mandy, because I love talking about the Enneagram. Okay. Well, so let's talk about your podcast. Tell the listeners about it. And then how have you been able to market your book or build your audience through that podcast? Because it does relate to what your book is about.
Yeah. So the podcast is Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I try to make it real simple for people to find all of the work. And it's weekly, alternating interviews with people that are either grief experts, educators, or people who are just grieving, and essays that I've written. So it's a weekly, I've been going for 3 years strong now.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of it was, and most of my work is around creating grief literacy and access to grief resources for people who are in care deserts. So whether it's a lack of people available, a lack of resources to cover the cost of mental health support while we're grieving, all of that came together for me in my brain as like, how do I create more accessibility as easily as possible for myself while still doing all of this other work. So the book was the first thing I put together. And a couple of months after I was finished with it and ready to start the publication process, our town had a wildfire of 2,800 homes destroyed, and a handful of my friends lost their homes. What I realized from that, which we turned into my book into a coaching practice immediately, just to show up and like, hey, can I walk through this with you? Would this be a practical, easy way to walk through? I realized, hey, there's just a lot of people who are not comfortable talking about grief in a group setting, not comfortable face-to-face one-on-one, but a podcast is passive. I have created a lot of ways to make it very active for my patrons and through workbooks that I've given away and lots of other invitations to do the work more intentionally. But a podcast is something we can pop on and clean our dishes to. It's something we can take a walk and reflect upon. And so for me, knowing that I'm calling people into this very vulnerable, difficult work, and I want them to have a sense of safety around them before they ever try to do grief work, because that's crucial for our nervous systems, then a podcast is going to be an easy way for me to share these ideas, for me to bring experts and individuals into the story who maybe someone's never heard of, and to help people one by one build this toolbox that's no longer just a hammer for every situation. Because when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. So the podcast became another resource for me personally. Some of the people I've met on my show, I'm like, can I study under you? Can we be best friends?
Yeah.
Are we friends now?
Yeah.
And at the same time, being able to just hear people who are grieving and identify over and over again, this is so unique. This is so individualized. I can point people to my book from it, which is great. But again, the book is a layer that is hard for my book particularly, right? It's a get into the work and do the work very intentionally. The tagline on my show is, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. So that is so true. And if you're able to listen to a podcast about loss, okay, well, you're maybe a level 1 or 2 of readiness for getting into your grief work, right? If you can get to the workbook, you might be a 3, 4, 5. But if you can buy a book, as my friend calls it, for grief insurance and just have it on your shelf, that is an opening for yourself that really can take you from maybe that 5 of readiness up to a 6, 7, 8, 9, because that's a pretty intense opportunity, is to walk yourself through loss like that. So I think the way that they both serve each other as far as like marketing wise is that they are one and the same. If you search restorative grief, everything is similarly named and it's for that purpose. And that was done by design. I could certainly write another book and someday might do so and start a different podcast. But there's something that's very beautiful about marrying the two titles with the different projects because it simplifies for people who are overwhelmed and inundated by marketing messages all day, every day.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I've only seen a few authors do that. And I love it so much when I see a podcast pop up that it's the name of a future book. You know, they're already thinking that far ahead of time. And like you say, it's just another resource. So I may find the podcast first and then discover the book or vice versa. And I love that so much about thinking about it being, you've just dropped so much stuff, Mandy. I'm going to have to like go back and listen to this a million times myself. But what did you call it where you put the book, where you have it on your bookshelf? What did you just call that?
Grief insurance.
Oh my gosh, I just love that so much. Well, and I was thinking, like, I'm a special needs mom and I have an adult son with autism. And, I was just talking to somebody else about this the other day that just, it's a constant grieving process. You haven't lost a child, but you've lost, milestones along the way that you thought you were going to have with your child. And just different things happen that, set you back and you do have to grieve about it. Grieve about it. And I was thinking, like, one of the moms that I met when I very first started at the church we go to, that she had lost her son, years prior to that. But she told me, it's like, whatever it is you're grieving, if it's a loss or this diagnosis or whatever, you better grieve now. You're going to either grieve now or grieve later, and it's going to be way worse later, And so I was like, oh, that's such great advice. So anyway, I'm just saying that I'm just so thankful for resources like what you're offering, Mandy, because, if you're not ready to talk to somebody about it, just to be able to listen to a professional on a podcast. I mean, I know that's where I get a lot of my information and learn so much from people. And it's such a low barrier to entry to kind of start learning about it. And then you might reach the next step. So yeah. Oh gosh, I'm here for everything you're saying. Hey, so let's talk about that. So that's hosting your podcast, which is so fun. But let's talk about guesting too, because how we originally connected is through the PodMatch platform. So I'd love to hear what your experience has been with PodMatch and if you've had any other opportunities to guest on other podcasts and what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I love showing up as a guest because as a podcast host, there's so much more work on the other end. So a guest is I get to just be here and enjoy your hard work and your labor and celebrate your creativity as well, which is such a gift. It's something that I definitely have enjoyed building community through. Like I said earlier, some of the guests that I've met, I'm like, we've done trades or I've shown up on their shows and been able to serve their audience too. But I do think I might be more discerning as far as who I bring on my show, simply because I have vulnerable audience members, right? I love and respect and honor the people who have incredible coaching practices and packages that they can sell. Here's 6 meetings, and by the end, I guarantee XYZ. Those aren't my people. So I tend to be extremely careful about who I will bring in, which can make it kind of hard on a platform like PodMatch. I have really enjoyed PodMatch and found some incredible people there. I also recognize it as I am also a marketer in my real life, in my world. I can see marketing, 10 miles away. And so it's hard as a guest, knowing that I don't want to disappoint an audience of listeners who are expecting one thing from me and I present something very differently. So I think knowing your message, knowing your voice, knowing that your audience is not going to be every audience, and knowing that who you are showing up as is not to promote your work, but to serve a listening audience, right? If I show up to promote my book and all I'm talking about is me, sure, I'm the guest, but the whole purpose of people listening to a show is to enrich their own lives, to gain something, to learn something, to have a little nugget. You want someone to have one tiny takeaway from everything they see of yours. And if it's just serving your own vision or your own plan, then you're not ever going to get beyond that really frustrating. Why can't I grow? Why is my audience stuck? Why doesn't it feel like people are connecting with me? Why does this feel so hard? Well, because it is hard, but it's also about knowing that you're there in a role of serving. And if I was paying for an hour session with someone, I would expect a different level of service from them. But if I'm getting a free hour of podcast wisdom, then I'm going to expect that they are there for me for a reason. They're not just trying to pitch their next package. I could talk about that a lot. So I'm going to stop there. I don't want to spiral for days, but
I know. Yeah. And I love that Alex and Alicia that founded PodMatch. I mean, they are all about service over selling. And so I love to follow that model, just like what you were talking about. And I would just think, through PodMatch, there's probably a lot of people that would want you on their show because there's so many different areas of grief you could talk about. But I so appreciate that you have, certain boundaries around that because it can get overwhelming. And like you say, some people I think look at it like, oh, I just want to be on a bunch of podcasts, but the audience you're wanting to serve and the message you're bringing, and you're not going to change that. I'm so thankful for people like that, Mandy. Well, is there anything else you would share? Because the audience is always looking for new ways to market their books. So we talk a lot about podcasting, obviously, but are there any other ways that you have found that you've been really successful at getting your message out there from your book, or, just building your audience of future readers?
I think for me, being very authentic in the community of people I want to serve is crucial. So I wrote the book in 2020. We're all isolated and stuck at home at that point. I joined Twitter that year because I thought, well, I'm bored and I can't leave my home and my family's tired of me. So maybe I'll make some friends online and see what that looks like. Who knows? They always say don't do it, but I'm not a good listener. So I ended up building this relatively small community of people. I would say there were 30 or 40 of us that ended up meeting in person about a year and a half later. Just for a weekend, we all flew to the city. It was like summer camp for grownups who were all part of the world of faith in some way or another. Former pastors, current pastors, people who'd completely walked away, people who were worried, who were questioning. And to this day, I talk to some of them on a daily basis. But what that showed me was I am in the middle of this group of people who are hurting, who are struggling with their faith in some way, or their faith isn't what they thought it was because they're hurting, right? That global untended grief I talked about, every one of them is experiencing it. And I was able to find people who are also of that growth mindset, who were open to learning something new, but not to insert myself as their teacher, but to join with them and say like, hey, me too. Hey, me too. And it turns out years later now, handfuls of them have written books. A lot of them are podcasters. Either they were at the time or they've become that. And so building a community of people like-minded, like you've said, and Podmatch is a great source for that. But finding people who have already gotten themselves invested or in the idea of connecting on a bigger scale than just selling a package, selling a book, right? People who are truly here for how do we make this world a little bit better, a little bit softer, a little bit safer, a little bit more loving and healing for people all around me. So honestly, that took a lot of recognizing my own values again. And that's something I do in the grief work with my clients, is just a ton of value recognition. Who are we now? We're someone different today than we were yesterday, last week, last month, last year. Who is that person? Are you in alignment with them, or are you struggling to find that place where that person belongs? And if so, that's okay. But what would it look like for you to maybe admit that where you are isn't quite the right fit for you? Whether that's your book not having a landing space, like I said, maybe you aren't in the right neighborhood for that type of book, or even your podcast. I also will say this, as I'm saying, find a community to support your work and your vision. It is also extremely hard to get the people who've known you for a long time to support your work and your vision. And I don't know why. I don't know if people think they know us and they don't trust us. Maybe people think we're just having a hobby and that's cute. No. But what I will say is that can't be a piece where we allow discouragement to remain, right? We can acknowledge, oh man, this whole community of people who I thought were with me don't necessarily listen to my show. And what do you mean you haven't read the book? It was 3 years ago that I wrote it. Okay. Wow. That's okay. It's not about us, right? That's always about where they're at in their life, their own values, whether they can say them aloud or not. And so recognizing your community might need to shift a bit if you want to grow into something new, like a podcaster, like an author, like both, or more. Yeah, you're growing into something new. You have to find the people who can grow with you.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Because you're right. I hear that more and more. It seems, and I see that myself too. Is it seems like they just don't get it. They just don't get it, so they're not along for the ride, and that's okay. There is a community for it, and we just have to remember that's okay. They don't have to be along for the ride. And I know people get bummed out about that, but yeah, that's such great advice. Well, this has been so wonderful, Mandy. I'm going to be sure and put links to all your goodies in the show notes. Is there any parting words you want to share before we wrap up our interview?
Well, enjoy the Grief and Enneagram workbook that you've got. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah.
And as I wrap up, just keep present with yourself through the process. It's really
Yeah.
easy to get critical and think really far out and think, okay, well, I'm never going to get there. So why do the thing? And stop and start with our habits and our goals and our writing skill, writing spaces, whatever we're doing. So I would just say, don't quit your progress because
Mm-hmm.
it's all progress. It's always going to be back and forth. There's always going to be growth. There's always going to be setbacks. And if you don't like restarting projects, then don't quit them in the first place. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh. That's awesome advice, especially for our community. Because I was thinking about that with grief. Another important thing to think about when you're reading Mandy's handout about, your Enneagram type and grief is just, how we grieve. Like a lot of our audience gets rejections from, publishing houses and agents. And, just like when you're trying to market online, there's things that happen. And so, yeah, I love that. That's, mic drop moments there for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, Mandy, I so appreciate your time today. This has been amazing. And I'm so glad we got connected through PodMatch.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Kim.
Thank you. Oh, goodness, y'all. I just have the best guests, don't I? I'm so grateful that God crosses my path with so many incredible women here to serve you. And of course, your feedback on the episodes means so much to me too. Be sure to check out Mandy's resources in the show notes, and I pray they're a blessing to you or someone else in your life who is grieving. Thanks for tuning in today, and as always, I'll be there for you to help you build your audience and reach new readers one podcast at a time. See you then.